Hey, it's Antrice, and welcome to another episode of the Savvy Painter Podcast. Savvy Painter is the podcast for painters who know that mastering your craft is a lifelong venture. They understand that the hardest part is showing up every day, whether they're inspired or not, and that we're all in this together. For the past 3 years, the Savvy Painter Podcast has been sharing tips and techniques that you can use every day in your studio. And when you join the Savvy Painter email list now, you get a collection of inspiring quotes and practical advice collected from years of Savvy Painter interviews. Just go to savvypainter.com/subscribe to sign up for weekly emails and get your free PDF, Essential Tips for Artists. Each week, I interview established artists like Anne Gale, Scott Connery, Rebecca Crowell, and many other artists who are willing to open their studio doors, share their painting processes, and talk candidly about what it takes to consistently grow your skills. We get into the nitty-gritty of their daily studio practice, what tricks they play on themselves to avoid getting caught up in perfectionism, how to use flashcards as reminders to stay on track during long painting sessions, and other cool tactics to quiet the inner critic and continue moving towards excellence. The Savvy Painter Podcast is filled with artists who generously share their stories, and by sharing their stories, they show the rest of us that we are not alone. So join us with the Savvy Painter email list and get even more connected with weekly emails. Sign up now and you get essential tips for artists, the inspiring quotes and practical advice collected from years of Savvy Painter interviews. Go to savvypainter.com/subscribe. It's that easy. Noah Buchanan is my guest this week. Noah studied classical painting and drawing at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and he received a Bachelor of Arts from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and later went on to earn his master's from the New York Academy of Art. His work is based in the academic tradition of the figure. Noah is attracted to images where there is a divine force or a mythological reference. He favors themes of the symbolic and heroic. In this episode, Noah tells the story of how a retrospective of the French painter Valentin de Bouillon pushed him to create the large-scale multi-figure work that he'd always wanted to tackle but had avoided. He sort of got permission to try these massive paintings from the old masters themselves. As he studied their work, he realized something profound. They made mistakes too. At some point, they struggled and learned from their challenges. When we see their work from an historical standpoint, meaning we have the advantage of hindsight, we can see all the great work they did and ignore the beginnings where they struggled a little bit. It's easy to overlook the fact that they were humans and not gods. Intellectually, we all know that. But when we stand in front of a canvas in our own studio, it's really easy to forget it. Noah and I also talk about where he gets his models, what makes a good model, and why using photographs is not actually cheating. So please enjoy this conversation with Noah Buchanan. Noah, thank you so much for being on the Savvy Painter Podcast. I'm excited to talk with you today.
Thank you, Antrice. It's really a thrill to be on Savvy Painter. I've been listening and really in awe of the company you've kept on this podcast.
Thank you. Can you tell me about when you started painting? I would love to hear about some of the early influences that that got you interested in becoming an artist.
Well, for me, it was more about drawing for sure early on. And that started super early. I was, around even like 5 and 6. And I think that it was just from looking at comic book illustrations and superheroes and being interested in Star Wars as a kid and making a lot of drawings of that kind of subject matter. But as I got into high school, I was looking at imagery principally from, I'd say, Albrecht Dürer and drawings and paintings by Michelangelo. And those were the first kind of big, very art historical figures that made me really want to start making artwork in a more serious way, other than just for kind of sake of my own entertainment as a kid.
Mm-hmm. Dürer that's impressive that you were looking at him in high school.
Well, I had a great art teacher, and my last 2 years of high school were in Southwest Florida, and he had a great classroom, and he had a bunch of art historical images around the classroom. And one of these was an engraving by Albrecht Dürer, and it was Saint Jerome in the wilderness, and it was a wood engraving of an old man kneeling in the wilderness, and just something about that image, it really sparked a lot of things for me that are still with me. But Yeah, there he was, and Dürer was right there, and Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling. The images of the Sistine ceiling were also in that classroom, and really I became really passionate about all of those things.
What are some of the things that have stuck with you about Dürer's work?
I think composition maybe was a big thing. And, maybe bigger than that, though, is just the feeling of mythology and the divine, and those two major elements coming together, coming to interface with a mortal figure. And that's still with me today as like a principal motif and content in my work is that feeling of the interface between the divine or the mythological and just the human. And I see that a lot or at least the implication of that in a lot of Dürer's work.
Yes. Or people who've never seen your work before. How would you describe it?
Well, I work mostly in oil paint, and I paint the figure mostly, although I've definitely put many, many hours and many years into painting still life and landscape. But the figure is definitely my primal interest. And it's an anatomical approach to the figure. So in other words, understanding anatomy, the musculoskeletal system of the human figure, and then approaching it in paint in the way that 17th century painters would do. So artists like Van Dyck, Rubens, and I should say both 16th and 17th century painters. So I would include Caravaggio for sure, Rubens, and certainly Velázquez, and using the paint in a way that tries to champion behaviors of the flesh and of the anatomical system of the figure. So I love it. There's a very simple behavior in oil paint where the light mass on a figure is very transparent. I'm sorry, very opaque and full bodied, and the shadow is very transparent and earth tone, and the dichotomy of those two relationships really have always excited me from the first time I've noticed that in figure painting and started trying to do that myself. Just was very exciting to me.
Yeah.
So that's something that I think people tend to notice a lot in my paintings.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's so much fun to play with. It's just so juicy.
Exactly.
How do you choose your motif?
For me, as I was talking about with the Dürer influence earlier, and Michelangelo and so many others, but I have always loved it when I feel like there is some major divine force at play in the image, or a mythological element that is presenting themselves to this, sort of mere mortal figure, and their interaction between the two. So I always look for some feeling of that in the painting, even if it's a still life, or if it's a landscape. But I'm always looking for some feeling of that interaction or a conversation between those two forces. Mm-hmm. So like I've got a big thing going on in the studio right now that I'm sitting in front of, and that's definitely happening in that image. There's a mythological figure there to, interact with human beings. But then I think that I really love the way that what I just talked about with the behavior of the paint, the opaque lights, the transparent shadows. I love that interaction as also being consistent with that idea that you've got this light mass, which is, like you said, juicy and full of color and impasto paint and texture, detail, all of the sort of sublime stuff happens in the light mass. And then on the other side, the shadow mass is kind of like the poor struggling human condition, where it's transparent, it's earth tone, it's thin and washy, and it's like it's struggling to keep up, and so. Oh,
that's a great analogy. I love it.
Thank you. Well, I can't take credit for it. It comes from a lot of these 16th and 17th century painters. You can see them very aware of those kind of ideas when they're painting the figure.
So the piece that you mentioned, you sent me an image of this piece that you're currently working on, and both my husband and I were looking at it just going, whoa.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. And my husband usually doesn't, like he appreciates art, but he doesn't geek out on it anywhere near the extent that I will. So, but I'm so curious, how big is that piece? And can you talk a little bit more about why you started working that and what it means to you?
Oh yeah. That's like, every artist wants to talk about what they're working on right now, like from musicians to actors to painters, so I'm happy to talk about it. So it's an oil painting on linen, and it's 80 inches by 62 inches wide. So it allows for the figures to be life-size figures,
Uh-huh.
which is large for me. I think I've done life-size before with like a single figure or a portrait, but this is the first where it's.
This is intense. This one looks really intense.
Well, I'm glad it comes across that way. It came about because I try to go to New York as much as I can. I love New York City. They were having a show at the Met on a 17th century painter named Valentin de Bouillon.
I don't know his work.
Yeah, I didn't either. And it turns out he's a Caravaggisti, so very influenced by Caravaggio's chiaroscuro and everything that he did. And he worked principally in Rome, even though he was a French artist, but he was active in Rome at the time. And they did this huge retrospective of his work, and I and so many other people were just blown away by canvas after canvas of really large multi-figure compositions. And sometimes the canvases they're just packed full of figures, like 10, 20 figures, all engaged in kind of swirling, dramatic, chaotic activity. And he was so prolific, that the number of paintings he made is just staggering, and they're all huge canvases, and they deal with the subject matter that I really love, which is principally, Greco-Roman mythology and also biblical narrative. And so I was standing in front of his paintings, and I just thought, I just said to myself, it's way overdue that you've tackled this, as I'm saying to myself. And it's what I had wanted to do when I went into art school. I mean, I knew that. I said, well, I'm going to paint multiple figure compositions that have these big narrative ideas behind them and tap into an older historical tradition. And as I got out of art school and graduate school, what I proceeded to do was basically paint kind of maybe career safe still lives, portraits, certainly lots of figure paintings, but I kept it on the sort of the less risky side, like single figure paintings.
Were you doing that intentionally because you thought that's what people wanted, or were you just kind of like, I don't know if I want to tackle that quite yet?
Yeah, I think it was kind of all of those things. I was definitely a little bit afraid to do it, that it wouldn't work out. That I knew that there's definitely risks involved compositionally, spatially within a picture. Can you handle that many figures interacting? And there's a high likelihood that you fall on your face, trying to make a big, ambitious painting like that.
Mm-hmm.
I also was, I think, playing it safe for thinking about the gallery and thinking about would a painting sell or not. And also just logistically, like, could I make a lot of paintings that would be, would create a big body of work for myself, and that I could have a solo show in a gallery with. And I thought, well, if I do a huge, ambitious multi-figure painting, I'm not going to be able to make a lot of paintings, and I won't have the body of work. So I think all of those reasons kind of led me to play it safe for many years after becoming an actual professional painter.
So seeing these paintings at the Met, is that what pushed you over the edge, so to speak?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I just turned 40, and I was standing in front of these paintings at the Met, and I just thought, this is way overdue. I should have done this 10 years ago. And I thought, and I was ready to do it 10 years ago, but I maybe just a little hesitant for all the reasons we just went through.
Mm-hmm.
And on the plane ride home from that, I had my sketchbook out, and I was whipping out little thumbnail sketches for what would become this painting that's just about wrapped up in my studio right now. So I'm really excited about it because I'm happy the way it's come out.
It's impressive.
Oh, thanks. That means a lot because it's, I haven't really, I've shared it with the public in terms of like Instagram and Facebook, but it hasn't been like officially unveiled or anything. So keeping my fingers crossed, but just kind of giving it my all. And, there were a lot of revelations, I think, that came about from looking at this painter, Valentin de Bouillon. I bought the book from the gift shop after the show and was studying it very closely on the way home. And I still have it here on one of the desks in my studio. And what I noticed that kind of took away all the fear out of the whole process and formula and equation of making a multiple figure composition is that there was a lot of errors in a lot of these master paintings. And I think that we don't tend to notice them. I'll give you an example of one that, on closer inspection of one of these paintings, I noticed was that a figure in the foreground was a little bit too small compared to a figure in the background, of one of these paintings that have like 10 to 20 figures in them. And I went around looking at a lot of other masters for that kind of stuff, Rembrandt, Velázquez, Caravaggio. And when you're looking for it, you'll find it everywhere. And so realizing that the old masters made these mistakes too, just erased all of these fears in my mind that I could go ahead and do it. And then if I had those problems, if I did make those mistakes or those failures, it was okay. That it shouldn't stop me or prevent me from trying or from making the painting anyway.
I so agree with that. I absolutely applaud that revelation. That is so great, because the power of the work comes from the work itself, and the technicality is, of course it's important, but our minds are happy to sort of overlook that, or maybe even not notice it,
right, when
the image itself is really powerful and resonates on a very human level.
Yeah, that's the thing. Another example of that, and I think the kind of the root of my inspiration for these kind of paintings, even before Valentin de Bouillon came along, was Velázquez, and specifically his painting called Los Borrachos, which is Bacchus having wine with all of the vineyard workers, which is the same. Yeah, the drunkards, exactly. And it's the same subject matter I'm doing in this painting. So this is my homage to his Los Borrachos. But I was reading in one of the books on Velázquez and his paintings, I was reading about it, and the author criticizes that painting as, amongst all of its successes, the author criticizes the painting as not having a good spatial organization, and that it would not be plausible for all of these figures to fit into this tiny space that they're all crammed into. And I was kind of like, boy, the audacity of that author to say that, like this, to me, this work is sacred, and, it's like blasphemy to say that. But then I looked at it again and I thought, I guess the author has a point. And come to think of it, that kind of problem happens in a lot of these master paintings. And that whole thing, just realizing that, was so liberating to me, that I could just forge ahead and go ahead and make those mistakes, and sometimes you will make those mistakes and sometimes you won't, but you have to just keep trying, painting after painting. That's the big process right there, is the trying out, painting after painting.
Yeah. But I always wonder this. I'm curious what do you think? Do you think Velázquez did that knowingly, or do you think knowingly meaning like, okay, I know I'm taking some artistic license here because I want this particular thing to work? Or do you think he just hadn't figured that out yet?
It's kind of a guessing game, I think, on that. I could see either way. For one thing's for sure is he definitely pulls it off. Obviously, whatever the outcome, it's definitely a brilliant genius thing that he does. And I think, on the other hand, there's definitely a lack of any kind of evidence that he did studies or drawings in his paintings. So it's very likely that he kind of worked these paintings out right on the canvas. And I think that when artists do that, they are more prone to have those kind of problems, like spatial plausibility between figures. So I think some of it is, with him, it's genuine mistake or just faltering. And some of it is, maybe he was completely in control of what he was doing all the way through. But again, that idea of just kind of knowing that these guys could allow themselves to make mistakes and not be perfect, that kind of said, okay,
yeah,
it's time to get busy with these more serious paintings now.
Yeah, we can. I don't know if I can actually say that we can take them off the pedestal, but
right. It helps though.
Yeah.
If they're not so lofty, then they feel graspable, and that we could just dream of aiming for that.
Right. I'm curious, from your work, what memorable responses have you had to it? Because you've got some really powerful stuff. I'm wondering if there's anything that comes to mind when, showing your work, a particular reaction that stands out.
I think one of the most special ones that stays with me, and I've heard this from other artists that have made or do actively make sacred artwork, which is artwork for a church, is that you get some reactions there or some interactions with your work that you're never going to see in a gallery. And like one of the artists I'm thinking of is a contemporary painter in Southern California. He lives in Ojai, named John Nava. And he did these huge epic altar pieces for the Los Angeles Cathedral. And I was visiting him there at the cathedral, and he was showing me his tapestries and talking about the process of making them. And he was there when the church was just kind of still in heavy construction mode, like all kinds of iron girding around, and he had to go down and meet the architect and plan out where these tapestries were going to go. And he was there the day they brought in the corpus, which is the figure of Christ on the cross. They brought it into the church to plan out where it would go on the altar, and all the workmen came down off the scaffolding, came down to actively pray at the base of the corpus in the church. And I think John said something like, the architect turned to him and said, "Boy, you're never going to see that in the gallery." Yeah. And so, so it's a very different thing. So anyway, I've had the opportunity to make paintings for the church in the past. I made 2 really large altarpiece paintings for the Shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And I get emails on a fairly regular basis just from abroad, from people who have made pilgrimages to that cathedral. And they express these just incredibly sweet and honest and very spiritually meaningful feelings in their emails. And, somebody said that they took their newborn and held it up in front of one of the paintings I had made for a blessing from the saint that was depicted in the painting. And that was a whole nother level, hearing that. Yeah. That was just like, whoa, that's different from like me painting a still life and, someone saying, "Oh gosh, that fruit is so delicious looking. It feels like I could just take the pear out of the bowl." And like, that's wonderful too. I love hearing that. But this was a whole nother level,
Oh, yeah.
That people were using your work as a spiritual vehicle. And, that was really meaningful to me.
To be honest, it doesn't surprise me that they would use your work as a spiritual vehicle. What surprises me is they took the time to find out who the artist is, to be honest, because usually, when you go into a church, you're there obviously for a very specific reason. And it's not your normal person. It's not to look at the art. The art is there for the purpose that they're there for, whether it's, they're going there in times of trouble or for reflection or whatever. But I'm just so impressed that they tracked you down.
Yeah, that is really nice. And I think what you said is true. There's a lot of times artists work in a church, unless you're walking around Rome and you're like, purposefully looking for Caravaggio's altarpieces. And a lot of times the artist's work kind of gets maybe overshadowed by the church itself. So you'll see the sculpture and the paintings, but you sort of attach it to the church and you maybe don't look for who did this piece. So yeah, it is really rewarding when they take the time to track you down, to ask you about the paintings or just express some meaningful experience they had with your painting.
Yeah, to me, that's the most incredible thing about your story. Of course, flattering is the right word, but it is gratifying to know that people respond to your work to that degree.
Yeah. Yeah. Very flattering. Very flattering.
I would love to hear a little bit about your personal successes. Was there a moment or a decision you made that you feel like was a personal success?
Oh boy. Let's think about this for a second here. Because, I think that's a great question, because I think a lot of painters, I don't know, I have a feeling a lot of painters, when we look at the road behind us, there's probably a lot of us just kicking ourselves going, "Oh, why didn't I take that opportunity?" Or "Why did I move here?" Or, "Well, why did I go with this gallery, not that gallery when I had the choice?" That's definitely the case for me. I definitely kind of maybe beat myself up a bit internally in terms of choices and decisions and paths not taken. And I think sometimes things that are successes can be like a blessing and a curse. They can they have their upsides and their downsides. I think it was one thing I would never change is that I made the decision to go to the New York Academy in Manhattan for grad school. And I went there principally to study with a woman named Martha Mayer Erlbacher. She was teaching there at the time, and I went there to study with her, and I became very close with her both personally and then also just as her student. And I've learned so much from Martha about painting, about aesthetics and meaning and content in work, and also about anatomy. She taught me a lot of anatomy, which I is still a huge part of what I do in my work and in my teaching. That just being in New York and then being able to study with Martha really opened doors and paths that I have not regretted. So that's a big one that I really cherish, a decision or something that happened.
I love that. That's so great.
Another one that I've always been happy about is that when I got out of grad school, which I realized later was very rare, somebody offered to introduce me to John Pence in San Francisco, of John Pence Gallery. And and I really jumped at that opportunity, and John agreed to start showing my work at that time. This was in 2004, and I just been out of grad school about a year and was starting to think about finding a gallery. And so that worked out. And I think that that's kind of an example of like maybe the blessing and the curse. I think that showing with John was an amazing, wonderful opportunity. And I think it also it presented a lot of challenges for me, in that I was suddenly found myself in a gallery where I was surrounded by painters that were extremely refined in their technical virtuosity as painters, and boy, I mean, they're all painters that I really admire and look up to their skill and technique, like painters like Will Wilson, Jacob Collins, and the list is very long. And as my first trip into the gallery, I think, rather than feeling like empowered as a painter that, oh, here's this renowned gallery that's going to show my work, I always felt going in there, especially the first few years dropping off work, I always felt like very, like almost too humble, very insecure.
Like, I'm not worthy. What am I doing here?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And also it caused me to maybe be really uptight in the studio, because you take that experience of feeling small and not worthy, and you go back to your studio to make more paintings, and you're thinking, oh God, I really gotta push it like 110%. And now you're thinking about specific paintings that you've seen, and not just that, you're thinking about presentation, like what kind of frame, and maybe things which are silly, and I think that bred into me a kind of a lot of unnecessary nervousness and insecurity. But I would go back to Velázquez as a big hero, because he, one day, after many years of this kind of insecurity and feeling small, I think looking at Velázquez both in books and in the museum, and you see his work up close, and you realize, gosh, he's really comfortable and at ease, and he's not worried, and you could just tell he's not concerned what other people think, and he's definitely not concerned about, is the painting neat and clean and refined? I mean, when you look in Velázquez's paint, you see like dirt and schmutz and drips, and you can see places where he's wiped his brush on the side of the painting to clean it, And so he kind of was this glimmering voice of confidence that came through and said, hey, just don't worry about that so much. You don't have to be as slick and as tight as these other painters. Just be yourself. And I think the moment I started doing that, I started enjoying my experience showing it with John Pence a lot more.
Oh, that's so interesting, because that's what I was going to ask you, is how did you get past that feeling that you didn't belong there?
Yeah, I think it was just simply going, you know what? I really can't be these other painters. The work doesn't come out well when I try to do that. I don't enjoy myself when I'm painting, when I'm trying to do that. And just, you really just have to do what's natural and embrace that.
Yeah, it's so interesting that it's such a hard thing to do, I think, for people to let go of that worry about what other people think or how they might look, or just that whole thing. And people, doesn't matter if you're an artist or not, but just as human beings, we enslave ourselves with that. And there's so much freedom in just saying, okay, I'm going to trust myself.
Yeah.
And I'm going to trust everybody else that if I am myself, that everything will be okay. And that, the pain, in fact, it'll be better because you'll be happier. You'll be more secure. You'll have more fun. You'll be able to explore more. You'll dive down paths that you never would have. You'll create these epic multi-figure paintings because you saw this great show and now you know that that's what you need to do, you know?
Yeah, and I think authenticity is the thing. When you relax, as you're saying, the work is far more authentic. It feels more real and more just from your guts, and that I think that transcends everything else. The fact that it feels genuine and authentic. I'm really wary of, both in myself and in colleagues and in students. There's this dangerous moment I think that we take as painters where we say, and I see this a lot in grad students, and who can blame them, but I see them, they basically sit down and have a private moment with themselves where they say, what can I do to make my work more fashionable and more intriguing to the current art scene? Well, we kind of make a big splash or a big shock statement to the world that will get me some recognition. And I think very often the answers to those questions are things that lead an artist away from themselves. And they come upon these solutions to that question that aren't the best solutions, I think. So I'm always wary of that in myself, whether it's about content or maybe even technique. And I think showing with John, there is an example of technique where I thought, I should really tighten up my painting skills. And I mean, tighten up my presentation, how polished, how blended, how refined, what level of realism am I aiming for? And it wasn't from myself. It was from some feeling of obligation or something like that.
Oh, that's really funny. I remember somebody once told me that they thought my painting was sloppy. And this when I was in college. And it stuck in my head. And for years after that, I'd always be like, oh, it's so sloppy. It's so sloppy. I can't do that. It's so sloppy.
Right. Yeah. And it's like when a child with issues about their parenting,
Right. And the funny thing is, I don't even remember who it was that told me that, or, it could have been an instructor. It could have been a teacher. It could have been some guy walking down the hall that has, and why that statement became so powerful. I'm really fascinated by that.
I know your paintings well. So I think it's interesting though, that what maybe was, I wasn't there to see it, but maybe what was sloppy at one point has now become very painterly. That's a much better word. And that's something that, we strive for. So I love the painterly quality in your landscapes. And so in a way, that was a good thing, that if your paintings were sloppy. They've obviously matured to sort of blossom into what they're supposed to be.
Yeah. And I think, thank you. But I think that the interesting thing is how, as artists, we pull in all these little hangups or whatever. And the thing, usually, when you were talking about these artists thinking about what can make them more fashionable, what they're really asking is, how can I stand out? How can I get noticed?
That's right. That's exactly the question.
And the answer is to me, it's so simple, but it requires a lot of hard work. The answer is do great work. Be yourself, put yourself out there. Don't become a cookie cutter of some other artist that is, that you can never be, because nobody can be you and you can't be anybody else.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I think when I have the chance to visit and talk with graduate students, because I often go to the New York Academy for a visiting workshop or just to be a guest critic, I try to tell all of them to remember, what is it that really excited you about making painting in the first place? Why did you come here? Maybe ask that question. Remember what your visions were in your head at that moment. What did you dream that your paintings would look like at that time? And then make work that aims for that, and maybe don't set your sights on how can I be famous? Because I see a lot of grad students doing that right now.
Oh, wow. That's dangerous.
Oh, it's very dangerous, but they all do it, and especially in New York, you've got Chelsea right there, and it's so alluring that they often kind of get pulled into that route.
It's very seductive.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
I got distracted because I actually went to the academy and was thinking about going there and then chickened out at the last minute. So as you're talking about it, I was
you did?
Huh.
Oh. No, the New York Academy is a wonderful place. I graduated from there for my graduate program, and then I returned and taught there for 2 years. And I just love the students there. They're so great. And when I teach there or have the chance to visit there, everything goes click. My teacher side goes click.
Yeah.
I feel like what I have to offer and what the students need are just like a great match. And yeah, it's really inspiring being there and to see what the students are doing. And then you're surrounded by wonderful faculty.
Yeah. Yeah. And the faculty is amazing, but then also the place itself, it's just a beautiful setup.
It is. Yeah. It's got a real ambiance to it. Well, next time you're in the area, you should definitely stop in, and they have visitors coming and going all the time of all different types of visitors. So,
but you're in Santa Cruz now, is that right?
Yeah. When I left graduate school and I left New York, I didn't necessarily intend to, but I landed in Santa Cruz and I found some teaching work right away, which was like, I didn't expect that to happen so quickly. And it snowballed into more and more teaching work.
At the university, or are you doing it on your own?
Yeah, at the university, at UCSC, University of California, Santa Cruz. And then a lot of other colleges in the Bay Area. Teach at a lot of different schools that drive around, commuting. And
yeah.
Although a lot of times I can fit my teaching days onto just a few number of days a week, and the majority of the week I can be in the studio, which is nice. But it's here in Santa Cruz is where my studio is. That's right.
I love Santa Cruz. It's beautiful.
It's a beautiful place.
Tell me about your studio practice. I would love to hear how you work. Do you bring models in? Describe that to me.
Yeah, I do. My process, and I'm actually writing about the process right now. I'm doing an article for a magazine that'll come out in the next several months on the kind of start to finish process. So basically, it starts with really, rough thumbnail sketches that kind of slowly mature up to a certain state. And when it's ready, I hire models to come in and start taking poses to match the poses that I've conceived of. So in other words, it starts off from invention, sort of imagining, well, what could this pose do and how could these figures fit together? And then it gets improved with observation of the model. And these days, I have been allowing myself to work from photographic reference a lot because I can get the models to match poses that I conceive of that are maybe difficult to hold from life.
Mm-hmm.
So I get more dynamic poses. And I think that's one of the big reasons why an artist might choose to work from photograph. I was definitely a heavy stickler about working only from life for many years. I think for about 15 years, I was very dogmatic, and I was very much on the side of the argument that no, it's got to be from life. An artist who works from photograph, it's just not the real thing. And I've heard, I've talked to so many artists about this topic and certainly heard it spoken about. I know like Stuart Chills, who I'm very in awe of his paintings, but I know Stuart Chills is like very anti-photograph. But I think that having been on both sides of the argument of that idea about working from models in the studio versus some work from models in the studio and some photographic reference or all photographic reference, I think I've been on both sides of the fence now. And what I noticed is that for me, having put many years into working from life only, I interpret the photograph in ways that are different from like copying from photograph. And you could really see like a student who maybe doesn't know the difference. You can see the difference in the work that they're maybe copying instead of interpreting.
How did you feel when you made the switch?
Honestly, I felt liberated. I felt like things were kind of like all the engines were firing now because I had tuned my eye to look and to read and interpret from life. But now I had the benefit of the photographic reference there, like being able to have poses that were more dynamic, action oriented. And of course, things like logistical things like not having to worry about the model showing up or not showing up that day.
Mm-hmm. And also holding those poses. Those are hard.
Exactly. Yeah. So that was really liberating in many ways. And I noticed, I was going to say, I feel like for me, I don't see a difference or feel a difference when I'm working from life or when I'm working from a photograph. And I think that's an important distinction to make for a painter is it should feel that way. If you're going to use photos, it should feel like the same feeling when you're painting, when you're looking from life, when you're looking at a photographic reference.
The feeling that you have when you're painting it?
Yeah, like it shouldn't be like, oh, this is very different. I think your mind should be interpreting both things in the same way.
Do you think it changed, other than the fact that you're able now to do these really dynamic poses in your work. Do you think it changed your work, making that shift?
Yeah, it did. It very much did. And like again, it just felt liberating to suddenly be able to say, oh, I can do this painting now because I don't have to worry about the model not being able to hold that pose. It also feels like when I conceptualize or compose a painting from scratch, you come up with these ideas in the painting that even as you're composing them, you're thinking in the back of your mind, there's no way the model's ever going to be able to hold this pose. And I think if you're one of these painters where it's like, yeah, but I got to work from life only. So now let me alter that composition so that it can accommodate a model posing in the studio. Mm-hmm. Now you're compromising your artistic dream and your vision. So I don't think that's a good thing. I guess an artist has to make a distinction as to, are they a perceptual painter? Are their paintings about like what they see? And that's a beautiful thing. You know, I think like Stuart Schill's does that really well. Hollis Dunlap's paintings do that really well. He's one I really admire and look up to. Like Diarmuid Kelly as a British painter.
Yeah, his work is beautiful. Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. And these painters, you know, you can see that the paintings and the beauty of them is about the language of the lens of the eye, seeing and responding. And it's awesome. But then I think, okay, let's talk about two other big heroes of mine are Vincent Desiderio and Bo Bartlett. And these guys are more, you know, there is an element of that at play in their work for sure, the visual response. But it's much more about the narrative and the picture. You know, I mean, Vincent's even said that to me directly, that, you know, he's much more interested in making a picture. So I guess you have to figure out where you fall in that spectrum. And if the answer is that you're more interested in the narrative content, then I think that photographic references are going to be an important part of your process for sure.
That's a good point. It's interesting because I came also from that, you know, you do not use photographs.
Yes.
That was definitely part of my background. And so I was also very highly resistant and felt guilty when I did and felt like it was cheating and that it wasn't real and blah, blah, blah. But I think the other side of it is, well, this technology exists. So, you know, and these are tools that we can use. I think the problem happens when photography becomes a crutch. I think the problem is when you don't understand what you're looking at well enough to respond to the image that's the idea that's being photographed as opposed to this, you know, the camera's interpretation of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the camera's interpretation. And I think it's good for a painter to just kind of be, if they're gonna bring photography into their process, I think they should just be very wary of what the photograph is showing them. Like don't just say, oh, well, it's a photograph, so it must be right. You know, I think you should say, you look at the photograph and say, well, maybe. You know, right. Like you don't really trust what it's showing you, and you consider, you know, well, what's it showing me here? And you're sort of skeptical about it. And you rely more on your memory of the way light behaves on form and about anatomy. And you try to draw from your experiences working from life to help you improve what that photograph is telling you. Right.
And that's the key right there is relying on your memory and experiences. And the obvious thing behind that is that you have a memory of working from life and you did it enough that it's sort of ingrained in you and you can see where the camera's lying or you can see where it's not what you want it to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think another important realization I made one day after I'd been working with photographic references for a while is that I would come in, sit down at the painting, I would start painting, you know, 45 minutes to an hour would go by, and then I would like turn to maybe look at the photographic reference and remember that I never brought it out. Like I had been painting for an hour without looking at the photo. And that happens all the time. You know, or even if the photo's there, I'll find myself working on a section of the painting for 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And I realize I haven't looked at the photograph in a long time. And it's just more about the painting. You know, you're looking at the painting and responding to that. And you're asking yourself what's best for the painting, or you're trying to solve an answer about the way the light behaves on the form. And you're drawing upon your memory of that.
So I want to ask you a practical question because I know I will get this. I will get emails about this.
Okay.
Where do you find your models? How do you pick your models?
Well, for me, it's been very easy because I get to be a professor.
Yes.
It just, they fall into your life without having to do anything. And they come through in a way where they automatically know you and trust you and have already heard of you. And they're usually really flattered if you ask them to pose for you privately. You don't have to worry about coming across like a creep or something like that.
Yeah.
I think in most of my models have been, not all, but most of them have been models that were posing in a class of mine. In a few cases, they have been friends, long-term friends. Recently, I've been using my I call her my almost wife because we're getting married in 6 weeks. So
Congratulations.
oh, thank you. Very excited. She's been in a lot of the paintings recently. So definitely family members and, my spouse, they've recently have become a lot of my choices for modeling. But yeah, a lot has been studio models that I've met here in Santa Cruz, in the San Francisco Bay Area, New York, LA, all over. In one case, it was like one of the only times where I approached the man who was teaching my yoga class in New York City. And, I'm watching him go through all these yoga postures and I can see his physique. And I think, oh my gosh, he's going to be an amazing model.
I know. Yoga classes are so awful for artists because you're like, whoa, that's a great pose.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you can, embarrass yourself by staring at someone too long.
Mm-hmm.
And he ended up being a model for me. I approached him one day after class and asked him if he would feel comfortable. And he was really ready and willing to pose. And I have several paintings of him now. So yeah, I think that's the only case where I approached somebody that wasn't known to me as a model.
Yeah. I mean, the flip side of it is it's got to be really hard. I mean, if you are a model and you're modeling, in a way, you're taking a big risk going to somebody's art studio because you don't really know what you're walking into and you're committing to be hours alone with this person.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then on the flip side, it's like you also need to find somebody who can hold a pose for a long time. And I think people who aren't either, at least I haven't been doing figure painting in a very, very long time. So this isn't, but to me, it feels like dancers and yoga instructors are the best models because they understand their body and they understand what it means to hold a pose and they can anticipate how difficult something will be. And
yeah. And they have what I call gestural flow in their poses. So a lot of times you just ask them to take a pose and they're already aware that static pose needs to have this fluid rhythm to it. And they're going to build that into the pose without even having to discuss that idea with them. So that's why a lot of those dancers and yoga practitioners make great models. Also, I think if you're interested in anatomy as a figure painter, which I am for sure, then they often have the best examples of that. Although I have to say, I mean, I love painting the figure in any manifestation. I think that you study the skeleton and the muscular system intimately and you learn all of that. And then suddenly you get a really obese model where none of the definition shows and they're like the most exciting thing up on the model stand. And
yeah, I think it just, for me at least, and, again, I would never ever describe myself as a figurative painter in that sense but it just makes you fall in love with the human being, first you're looking at it very analytically. So it must be also uncomfortable for the model because you're just mentally taking them apart.
Right.
But the other thing is it also just makes you fall in love with all the different shapes that human beings come in. I think it's just so beautiful.
Yeah, it really changes your idea of what beauty is, and we're all aware of what the cultural ideas of beauty and perfection should be. We're supposed to be in good shape and muscular and skinny and athletic, and then when you see not that on the model stand, and it's really beautiful, and you're actually trying to get that on your drawing or your canvas. You're trying to recreate their body. Suddenly, that's perfect. It's like, well, that's the perfect thing that I'm trying to get. You feel the irony of that where you think, well, society's telling me I'm supposed to have a flat stomach. And then here I'm drawing somebody who's got the opposite. And that's what I'm going for in this work of art. It's like it really turns everything on its head about your idea about the human body and beauty surrounding the human body. It's a real game changer.
It is. What single habit do you think strongly contributes to it can either be your success or your continued growth, however you want to interpret that?
I think that because it occurred to me one day, sort of in a moment of frustration or a moment of feeling disappointed at where I was with my process or my career or all of the above, which, as we're all prone to those moments. And I get emails from students all the time asking me like, well, I feel like I'm not good enough and what should I do? And so I'm constantly like a therapist, an art therapist in emails to my students, and they want to know what they should do. And I point out to them, look, you might be halfway there, but you've come too far to turn back. So to answer your question, Antrese, that just the idea that I've invested way too much time and effort in my life to turn back now has kept me moving forward, even through moments when I'm feeling like unsatisfied with where I'm at, either technically or career-wise or in the content of the work. There's this kind of prevailing voice that says, you're going to keep going. You're going to keep going. So you just kind of tell that side of yourself to just shut up and, you acknowledge that
you're not fooling anybody.
Yeah. You say, what, are you going to quit? What are you going to do? Quit? That kind of, you have to tell yourself that. And then it's kind of funny. You laugh at yourself. But yeah, I mean, I'm not going to stop painting, Yeah. And then the other question that comes right after that, as soon as you say that to yourself, is you say like, well, okay, and what would happen if I just keep going? Like, where will I be in 10 years if I don't stop, if I don't slow down? What will my work look like then? Like, it's definitely not going to be the same. It's bound to have improved. A lot of things will probably have happened to me by then, both good and bad. And, I need to find out what those things are. So I think that is a prevailing habit that I've had since the beginning. And I've been really serious about drawing and painting since I was very small. And, like 5th, 6th grade, it became pretty solidified for me that I wanted to go to art school and pursue it. So, and it was always just this voice that, I'm not going to stop. And I might go through periods of making poor work or bad work or feel lost in my process, but I'm just going to keep going. And I'm bound to pass through some moments of confusion and feeling lost, but I'm also bound to pass through like these really sublime parts of my career and my experience of being a painter. So I think that's how I would answer that question.
It's a great answer. And I've always thought of it in terms of my next question is typically what would my life be like if I stopped, and it just feels like a death, Mm-hmm. So that inspires me to keep going. But I like what will it be like in 10 years from now?
Yeah. If I keep going.
Yeah. If I keep going, because it's kind of in some ways easy to answer. If you look back 10 years, you can see how much you've grown. That's
right. Yeah, you can see how much you've improved, not just in your practice, but then you can look at your career and say, oh, look what happened 10 years ago. I hadn't had that solo show. I hadn't had that write up in that magazine or newspaper, and all these like really exciting things for a painter. They happen if you just keep going, but you got to get through these dark times. A student just wrote a frustrated email to me asking what they should do. And I said, you really have to push some technical training for the next 2 or 3 years. And I said, but you're by far not a beginner. And I said, so if you were taking a road trip from San Francisco to LA by car, I said, I would say right now you're in Colorado Springs. And, I said, look at a map and you'll see it's like you're just about halfway. And that means you're too far to turn back. It's like it would just be disastrous to turn back. But there's definitely a road ahead and it's got to be traveled, so that's how I think about it sometimes.
I love it. Noah, thank you so much for this conversation.
Oh, thanks, Antrese. I'm just like so honored and thrilled to be on Savvy Painter. You've interviewed a lot of my heroes and it's very humbling to be amongst them. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Show notes for this episode are on savvypainter.com. Just click on the podcast tab to see some of Noah's paintings. And he was kind enough to share the painting that he's currently working on. So definitely check that out because it is impressive. You can also get links to all of the artists and resources that we talked about. Again, that's at savvypainter.com/podcast. Savvy Painter, Gamblin Artist Colors, and Trekell Art Supplies are teaming up together to do our first online art competition. Artist Carol Marine will be jurying the show. You might remember that Carol was a guest on The Savvy Painter. She's a painter herself and the founder of dailypaintworks.com. First place winner will receive $500 in merchandise from both Gamblin and Trakell, plus a cash prize of $250. But that's not all. The first place winner will also be a guest on the Savvy Painter podcast. So if you win first prize, you get your work in front of tens of thousands of people, $1,000 worth of art supplies to paint to your heart's content, and some cold hard cash. Entries are being accepted from now until October 29th, 2017. Go to savvypainter.com and click on the Call to Entries tab for more information. I can't wait to see the great work that you submit. Good luck. I want to send a big thank you to those of you who support the podcast. This podcast would not be possible without the help of listeners like you. Does that sound a little NPR-ish? Maybe. Jasmine Alliger, Srivana Nara, Jiyoung Kim Studio, Gabrielle McDermott, The Roaring Artist, Don Chandler, Carla Roth, Virgil Dyson, Kenneth Burke, Maureen Nathan, The Kathy Beeler, Alexis Redden, Christine Curtin, Gail Height, Art of Joy, and the one and only Barry Koplowitz, who I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing his name correctly, because in all the time that he has been supporting this podcast, he has not once complained about how I say his last name. Thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it. Until next week, this is Antrese Wood with the Savvy Painter podcast. Thank you so much for listening.